The morning Neil Kowalski walked into the lobby of Hargrove Industrial Solutions, he was not there to make trouble. He was there because the contract said he had to be. He had the folder under his arm, the same folder he had been carrying for 11 days, driving past the building twice, telling himself he would go in, then finding reasons not to. He was not afraid of the building. He was not afraid of the people inside it. He had spent 22 years fixing things that other people said could not be fixed, and he had learned a long time ago that the only thing fear ever built was more fear. But he knew how lobbies like this worked. He had been in enough of them. The glass and the marble and the lighting, designed to make you feel like you were already behind. The receptionist who would look at his jacket, canvas, worn at the elbows, still clean but not the kind of clean that impressed anyone in a building like this, and make a decision about him before he said a single word. He went in anyway. Because the contract said he had to be there by the 15th, and it was the 14th, and Neil Kowalski had never missed a deadline in his life. The woman at the front desk had a name tag that said Brenda. She looked up when he came through the door, and her expression did not change, which was its own kind of answer. He told her his name. He told her he was there to submit documentation under the terms of a service review agreement signed in March. He placed the folder on the counter in front of her, not sliding it, not dropping it, setting it down the way a man sets something down when he wants it to be part of the record. Brenda looked at the folder. She looked at him. She asked if he had an appointment. He said he did not, but that the agreement did not require one for document submission. He said the deadline was tomorrow and he had come in person because the email address on the contract had bounced twice, and he wanted confirmation of receipt. She picked up the phone and called someone. She spoke quietly. When she put the phone down, she told him someone would be with him shortly and asked him to take a seat. He sat. He watched the lobby. People in suits moved through it the way people in suits always moved through lobbies, purposeful, a little performative, making sure their purposefulness was visible to anyone watching. A few of them looked at him the way you look at something that does not belong where it is, not hostile, just noting the discrepancy. He was used to that. He had been the kind of kid who fixed the furnace in a house where the furnace was the only thing standing between his mother and a bad winter, and he had grown into the kind of man who could diagnose a mechanical failure by sound alone, who knew the tolerances on a compression system the way other men knew the rules of football. He did not look like what he was. He had never looked like what he was. He had made peace with that a long time ago. What he had not made peace with was the way Konrad Kellner had used it against him. Konrad Kellner was the kind of man who had learned early that confidence, projected loudly enough, could substitute for almost anything. He had not built Hargrove Industrial Solutions from the ground up. He had married into it, restructured it, rebranded it, and done so with enough conviction that most people forgot he had not been there at the beginning. He was 53 years old, and he had the kind of face that photographed well from certain angles, and he knew which angles those were. Neil had first encountered him 14 months ago, when Hargrove had contracted his shop, a 12-person operation called Kowalski Precision, based out of a converted warehouse in Millhaven, for a series of diagnostic and repair jobs on their secondary processing line. The line had been failing for 3 years. 2 larger firms had looked at it and said it needed to be replaced entirely. Neil had looked at it for 4 hours and told them it did not. He was right. He fixed it in 6 weeks. The line ran cleaner after he was done with it than it had run when it was new. Konrad Kellner had shaken his hand at the completion meeting and told him it was impressive work. He had said it the way people say things they do not entirely mean. Impressed enough, but already thinking about what came next. What came next, Neil found out 9 months later, was a second contract, larger. A full system review of Hargrove's primary processing infrastructure across 3 facilities. The contract included a performance and compliance review period, a documentation submission deadline, and a payment schedule tied to approval milestones. Neil had read the contract 3 times before he signed it. He had his neighbor's daughter, who was in her 2nd year of law school, read it too. She said it was standard but that the approval milestone language was loose. He made a note of that. He signed it anyway, because the money was real and his daughter's tuition deposit was due in the fall, and Kowalski Precision had been running on thinner margins than he let on to anyone except his accountant. The work took 7 months. He submitted the preliminary findings on time. He submitted the interim report on time. He sent follow-up emails when responses were slow, kept copies of everything, documented every site visit, every diagnostic, every adjustment. He had learned a long time ago that the paperwork was as important as the work itself, and he treated it accordingly. The final documentation, the package that would trigger the approval review, and the payment that went with it, was due on the 15th of April. He was standing in the lobby of Hargrove Industrial Solutions on the 14th. The man who came down to meet him was not Conrad Kellner. He was a younger man, mid-30s, with the look of someone who had been sent to handle something unpleasant and had decided the best way to handle it was to be vaguely unpleasant himself. His name, he said, was Fowler. He did not offer a first name. Fowler looked at the folder on the counter. He looked at Neil. He said that Mr. Kellner had reviewed the preliminary findings and had some concerns about the scope of the documentation. Neil asked what kind of concerns. Fowler said that the approval team felt the report did not adequately address certain performance benchmarks outlined in Section 4 of the contract. Neil said he had addressed every benchmark in Section 4. He said he had cross-referenced each one explicitly and could walk Fowler through the relevant pages if that would help. Fowler said that was not really a conversation they could have in the lobby. Neil said he was happy to have it wherever was convenient, but that he needed confirmation of receipt for the documents regardless. Fowler said he would need to check with Mr. Kellner about the documentation process. Neil asked how long that would take. Fowler said he wasn't sure. Neil stood there. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift his weight or look away, or do any of the things people do when they are on the edge of losing composure. He simply waited, the way a man waits, when he knows that waiting is the correct move, and he is willing to make it as long as necessary. Fowler made a phone call. When he came back, he said Mr. Kellner would come down personally. Conrad Kellner arrived in the lobby 11 minutes later. He was wearing a charcoal suit, and he had the easy, unhurried walk of a man who had never once been kept waiting for anything in his life, who had in fact spent considerable energy ensuring that was the case. He looked at Neil with an expression that was almost friendly. The kind of almost friendly that meant the opposite. He said it was good to see him. He said he wished the circumstances were different. He said the documentation Neil had submitted, the preliminary and interim reports, had raised some questions and that those questions had led the approval team to put the final review on hold pending additional clarification. Neil said he had not received any communication about a hold. Conrad said there had been some internal delays in getting that notice out, and he apologized for that. Neil said his final submission deadline was tomorrow. He said he needed to know if there was an issue with the review process that would affect the payment schedule. Conrad's expression shifted slightly, still almost friendly, but something underneath it that was not friendly at all. He said that the payment schedule was tied to approval, and that approval was tied to the review, and that the review was currently on hold, and that these things took time. Neil said he understood that, but that the hold needed to have a basis in the contract language, and he would like to know what that basis was. Conrad looked at him for a moment, just a moment. Then he smiled. He said Neil was a good mechanic. He said that sincerely. He said the work on the secondary line had been genuinely impressive. But he said that this, and he gestured not at anything specific, but at the conversation, at Neil, at the situation. This was a different thing. This was a contract dispute. And contract disputes, he said, had a way of getting complicated very quickly when the parties involved didn't have the right people in their corner. Neil said he was not looking for a dispute. He was looking for confirmation of receipt of his documentation. Conrad said he didn't think he could do that today. Neil asked why. Conrad said the documentation was under review. Neil said the documentation he was holding had not yet been submitted. It was still in the folder on the counter. It had not been reviewed by anyone. He said he would like someone to accept it and log it under the existing agreement. Conrad looked at the folder. He looked at Neil. Something changed in his face. Not anger, not exactly. More like the quiet calculation of a man who had just decided to stop pretending the conversation was something other than what it was. He said, and he said it loudly enough for Brenda at the desk and Fowler, and the two people who had drifted to the edges of the lobby to hear him clearly, that he thought Neil needed to leave. Neil said he would leave once someone accepted the documentation. Conrad said he was going to have security escort him out. Neil said that was his right. Conrad said, and here for just a moment the almost friendly dropped away completely, and what was underneath it was something colder and more precise. He said, "I've dealt with contractors like you before. You think the paperwork protects you. It doesn't." Security arrived 2 minutes later, one guard, then a second. They were professional about it, which Neil appreciated. He did not make it difficult. He picked up the folder, because no one had taken it, no one had logged it, and it was still his, and he walked toward the door ahead of them. At the door, he stopped. He turned back to the lobby. Conrad was still standing there, watching. Fowler was beside him. Brenda was at her desk. There were 6 or 7 other people visible, staff moving through, a delivery person by the elevator, a woman in a blue blazer who had stopped pretending to check her phone. Neil opened the folder. He took out the top document, the cover sheet, which had his name, his company, the contract number, and the date, and which also had, in the bottom right corner, a small notation that most people would not have thought to put there and fewer still would have understood. He placed it on the counter in front of Brenda, face up. He said, "That's for the record." Then he walked out. His daughter's name was Abby. She was 9 years old, and she wanted to be a marine biologist, which Neil thought was the best thing he had ever heard anyone say. Her mother had died 4 years earlier, a car accident on Route 9 in December, black ice, a telephone pole, the kind of thing that did not have an explanation that made any sense no matter how many times you tried to find one. He had been at the shop when it happened. He had been under a compressor housing, tracing a fault in the intake manifold, and his phone had rung, and he had almost not answered it because he was in the middle of something. He still thought about that sometimes. The almost. He had raised Abby alone since then, with help from his sister Donna when he needed it and not much else. He had made it work the way he made everything work, by understanding what the actual problem was and not spending time on anything that wasn't the actual problem. Abby went to school. She did her homework at the shop on a folding table by the window while he worked. She knew the names of every tool on his bench and could hand him the right one without being told, which he considered one of his better parenting achievements. He had taken the Hargrove contract because of her, because the money would cover the tuition deposit and the brake job on his truck and the water heater that had been making sounds it should not make for the better part of a year, and because he had told himself that this was what you did. You found the work, you did the work, you got paid, you kept going. He drove home from the Hargrove lobby and picked Abby up from school, and they ate dinner. And she told him about a documentary she had watched about bioluminescent jellyfish, and he listened to all of it and asked questions and felt, in the way he sometimes felt after the worst parts of a day, grateful that the best part of his day was still reliably this. After she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything he remembered from the conversation in the lobby. The exact words, the sequence, who was present, what was said and what was not said. He did this not because he had been planning to, but because his father had told him once that the difference between a man who got taken and a man who didn't was usually just a matter of who had written things down. Then he made a phone call. Her name was Janet Okafor. She was a contract compliance attorney, and she had an office above a dry cleaner on the east side of Millhaven, and she charged a rate that Neil could technically afford if he was careful about everything else. He had found her through a client of his, a small manufacturing outfit that had gotten into a billing dispute with a parts supplier 3 years ago and come out of it intact, which was the most persuasive recommendation he could imagine. He called her at 8:15 in the evening, and she answered on the third ring, which told him something about her. He explained the situation. He explained it clearly, in the order it had happened, without editorializing. When he was done, there was a brief silence. She said, "You kept copies of everything?" He said yes. She said, "Including the submission attempts? The email bounces?" He said yes. She said, "And the notation on the cover sheet you left at the desk, what was that?" He told her. The notation was a document hash, a cryptographic fingerprint of the complete submission package, generated the night before, time-stamped and stored on a server he paid $12 a month to maintain. It meant that the document he had left on Brenda's counter, and the timestamp attached to it, could be verified against the original package to prove that the content had not been altered and that it had existed in its current form before the submission deadline. He had started doing this 3 years ago after a client tried to claim he had submitted revised invoices after the fact. Nothing had ever come of the notation before. He had put it on every document since then, the way some people check the stove before leaving the house, not because they expect it to be on, but because the cost of checking is low and the cost of being wrong is high. There was a longer silence this time. Janet said, "Okay, I need you to bring me everything, all of it, tomorrow morning." What Neil did not know at the time, what he would not know until much later, when Janet laid it out for him across a conference table with the patience of someone who had untangled worse, was that the hold on his documentation was not about his documentation at all. Hargrove Industrial Solutions was, at the time Neil walked into that lobby, under an informal review by the state's Department of Industrial Compliance for a pattern of equipment certification irregularities at 2 of its 3 processing facilities. The irregularities were the kind that could, under certain readings of state code, expose the company to significant liability. They were also, under certain readings of the same code, the kind that could be addressed through third-party documentation, specifically, the kind of comprehensive independent diagnostic review that a qualified contractor might perform and submit as part of a service agreement. The kind of review that Neil had spent 7 months performing. The kind of documentation that was sitting in the folder he had been trying to submit for 11 days. Conrad Kellner had, it appeared, understood the value of that documentation before Neil did. The hold, the delayed notice, the missed emails, the vague talk of concerns about scope, was not an attempt to avoid paying Neil. Or not only that, it was an attempt to control the documentation, to delay submission until Hargrove's internal legal team had reviewed it, had time to prepare a response, had time to decide whether it was more useful to them inside the process or outside of it. What Conrad had not anticipated was the hash. What he had not anticipated was that the document Neil had placed on Brenda's counter, face up, in front of witnesses on the 14th of April, was, under the terms of the contract and the timestamping protocol Janet filed with the court, a valid submission. He had laughed at a man holding the key to his building, and the man had put it on the counter before he left. The first indication Conrad Kellner had that something was wrong was a call from his corporate attorney on a Wednesday morning in May. He was in a meeting when it came in, and he let it go to voicemail, which was a habit he would later wish he had broken. By the time he listened to the voicemail, there were 2 more calls waiting. Janet Okafor had filed a breach of contract complaint with the county civil court and had simultaneously submitted Neil's documentation package, hash verified, timestamped, intact, to the Department of Industrial Compliance as a third-party disclosure, which was permitted under a provision of state code that most people did not know existed, and that Janet had used exactly twice before. The submission triggered an automatic escalation in the compliance review. It also, because the documentation was thorough and because Neil had been very good at his job, provided the compliance office with a detailed and accurate picture of the irregularities at Hargrove's facilities. Irregularities that had been occurring for at least 6 years, and that had been, in several instances, papered over with certifications that did not reflect the actual condition of the equipment. The compliance office referred the matter to the State Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office had been looking for exactly this kind of clean, credible documentation for a case it had been building quietly for 2 years. The legal process was slow, as legal processes are. It did not resolve in a week or a month. Conrad Kellner hired good lawyers, and they filed motions, and the motions took time, and there were hearings and depositions and continuances. Neil attended what he was required to attend and stayed out of the rest of it. Janet told him what he needed to know, when he needed to know it, and he trusted her to do that, and she did. Hargrove paid the breach of contract judgment in June, the full amount of the contract, plus interest, plus Janet's fees, which the court awarded because the breach had been deliberate and documented. It was not a small amount. It was enough for the tuition deposit and the water heater and a year's worth of breathing room that Neil had not had in longer than he could accurately remember. In September, Conrad Kellner was formally charged with 6 counts of filing false compliance certifications and 2 counts of fraud. His attorneys negotiated. The process was ongoing, but the company's board had already begun the kind of quiet restructuring that companies begin when they understand that the name on the door has become a liability, and Conrad Kellner had not been seen at the Hargrove facility since July. Neil did not follow the case closely. He had work to do. He heard about the charges the same way he heard about most things. His sister Donna called him while he was under a hydraulic lift, and he heard his phone buzzing against the concrete floor. And he came out from under the lift and looked at the screen, and she had sent him a news link and 3 words. They got him. He read the article standing in the middle of his shop, grease on his hands, the lift humming above him. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and went back under the lift, because there was a fault in the hydraulic line that he had been trying to isolate for 40 minutes, and he was getting close to it, and he did not want to lose the thread. Abby came in at 4 o'clock from school. She had a science worksheet that she wanted him to check, something about ocean ecosystems, and she spread it out on the folding table by the window and asked him if he would look at it when he had a minute. He said he would look at it in exactly 1 minute. She said okay and started drawing a jellyfish in the margin of the worksheet. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over to the table and stood beside her and read the worksheet. It was good. She had gotten all of it right. He told her that. She said she knew, but she wanted him to check anyway. He said that was fair. Outside, the late afternoon light came through the window the way it did in October in this part of the country, flat and golden and going fast, the way things go when you are paying attention to something else, and then look up and notice what the light is doing. He had always liked this time of day in the shop, the day winding down, everything smelling of metal and oil and clean effort, the sound of traffic on the road outside, and his daughter's pencil moving across paper. He pulled a stool up to the table and sat beside her. She asked him how his day was. He said it was pretty good. She said something had seemed off with him lately, but that he seemed okay now. He said he was okay. He said there had been a thing at work, but it was handled. She said, "What kind of thing?" He said, "A paperwork thing. She considered this seriously." Then she said, "Did you keep copies?" He looked at her. She said she had heard him tell someone that on the phone once, and she had thought it sounded like good advice. He said, "Yeah, I kept copies." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her jellyfish. He watched her draw for a moment. The light through the window was doing something particular to the room, making it warm, making it feel, for just that moment, like a place that had earned its warmth. He thought about 11 days of driving past a building and finding reasons not to go in. He thought about a folder on a marble counter and a notation in the bottom right corner that most people would not have understood. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of man who checks. Not because he expects the worst, not because he is afraid, but because the cost of checking is low and the cost of being wrong is not something he is willing to pay on someone else's behalf. He reached over and borrowed Abby's pencil and signed the bottom of her worksheet the way teachers sometimes asked parents to. She said, "It's not due until Friday." He said, "I know, I'm just getting it done."